Welcome back to the Royal Palace, the podcast about French law and politics. I'm Patrick, here with my co-host Liam. Today, we are sitting down with Jathan Sadowski to discuss his latest book, The Mechanic and the Luddite, A Ruthless Criticism of Technology and Capitalism, published by the University of California Press. Listeners might know Jathan as co-host of This Machine Kills, a podcast about technology and political economy. He is also senior lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Before jumping into our interview, I just wanted to apologize to our listeners for not keeping with our regular schedule. Just after recording this interview in late February, I fell ill with the flu. Then just a few days after of having recovered, I became sick once again, with what I would eventually discover was appendicitis, which left me hospitalized for 5 days and required a surgical intervention. Now, though, that I'm recovering from the first of my 2 surgeries, I'm excited to get back to our normal schedule and more motivated than ever to talk about some of the important topics which divide France and the US. And healthcare comes to mind. So hopefully we'll have an episode on the national insurance system here in France in the coming weeks. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into our interview with Jathan.
I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk, stall and surrender.
All scientists, dynasties, entrepreneurs, the cultural soul of the nation.
You Americans have given us the sense grows very evil.
Great again.
Thanks for coming on, Jathan. And we both really enjoyed your book.
Yeah, great. No, happy to come on and talk to you guys. I have to, as an author, I have to do the relentless, it's a ruthless criticism, but I have to do relentless plugging as well. So so it is, of course, The Mechanic and the Luddite, a ruthless criticism of technology and capitalism.
The first thing I wanted to ask was just who you wrote this book for, like who was your intended audience for this book?
Who I wrote the book for is, ideally, I think I wrote it for everybody, right? But I think more specifically, I wrote it for people who want to understand this current moment a little bit better, like where the relationship between tech capital, if we think about kind of, Silicon Valley as the representation, the avatar, the locus point for technological capital or this kind of this ascendant dominant mode of capitalism that's organized around information technology and the kind of ideologies of optimization and efficiency and so on that we see coming out of Silicon Valley, and how that those ideas of technology I think more now than ever are so obviously defining what capitalism means, and then how capital is interacting with the state, defining society, invading and restructuring people's lives. If we think about Silicon Valley as the kind of the locus point of that, then I feel like someone like Elon Musk is now the avatar of it. And so, I've been criticizing technology and capitalism for a very long time, but nobody has done a better job of changing the public's mind than the people who are at the center of technology and capitalism, right? Like they have been doing our PR for us in terms of changing the public's attitudes towards oh man, these people don't have my best interests at heart. They're monsters, and I need to understand this whole system better. And so that's the kind of people I'm hoping pick up the book.
Yeah, well, one of the things I said to Liam, when I was, 1 or 2 chapters in, I said, one of the things I really liked that you did is you brought forward a definition and a critique of idealism that I actually think I could hand the book to somebody who's not into Marxist theory, and that they could understand it, consume it, and feel like people aren't just throwing. I mean, everyone knows the conversation with kind of the Marxist, right? Who goes oh, that's idealist thinking, and everyone's oh, idealism? I like that. Sounds great, and they're kind of not really in the whole philosophy mindset, I suppose, of it. And so that's something I certainly liked about the book.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought it was. You said in the beginning of the book, if I say technology, you should think of power. And I just a question I came away with was how you see modern technology, information technology, as is it fundamentally different from previous technological developments in capitalism, or is it just another like what makes it uniquely worth talking about?
Yeah, and that's right. Like that's one of the very early core arguments, so this kind of laying out, as you said, Patrick, around like what idealism means. And this is something I really try to do in all of my writing, which is like distill down these kind of heady concepts or arguments that often come from social theory or from Marxism, and places that I think we need to turn to for ideas of how to analyze critically and understand these kind of dynamics around like why should we think of power when we think technology, but they do tend to be really hard and dense to get through. And I think that does a real disservice to their explanatory power. And so something I really try to do a lot in my books, and in all of my work is like, think about how would I explain this to just a normal person, right? Someone who is not in a like philosophy grad seminar, or like has a PhD in sociology or whatever it might be. Like, how would I describe like why, like what idealism means in this sense, right? In the sense of like, organized, like thinking that the engine of change in society is just like your willpower, your desires, your value, the divisions that you have, this kind of mental force as the only thing that really matters, right? And that's something that really, I think, is central to Silicon Valley, is like putting forward a lot of, we call it hype, but it is this kind of like idealism, but not idealism in the sense of like, I think the world will be a better place. They do, but in their own way. But idealism in the philosophical sense of like, all that matters is that we have like, that we put forth visions, that I express my desire in a strong way. It doesn't matter if it's like connected to any like material, concrete reality, or how those visions are completely disconnected and contradictory to like the actual material conditions of people's lives or the systems that they're building and how they work and so on. And then this, and I think that's also part of this idea of like technology is power. And your question is why information technology, is it unique? And I don't think so. In the book I talk about that I focus on IT, on information technology, largely because it defines this current moment, right? Like it is an enabler for all kinds of other industries and processes, right? All companies and all government agencies, all institutions of all kind, of basically any size, have like an IT department. Maybe it's an IT guy, but maybe it's a whole IT department, even if their business is not IT. And that's because IT is now so thoroughly wrapped up in everything that we do and the way that we understand how things are done. And that gives it a lot of this like pervasive power in terms of what people in Silicon Valley would call disruption, right? We're going to go into other industries, other processes, other activities, other areas of life, and we're going to disrupt them. And the reason why they say they can do that is because IT is pervasive in all those places. And so they think, as a startup executive on Twitter said recently, I forget his name, but it was saying that like Silicon Valley has made the modern world. Why shouldn't we run it? And it was in regards to like a positive affirmation about Doge, about the Department of Government Efficiency. And that kind of attitude, I think, has also motivated Silicon Valley's own aspirations and their own success at becoming so central. But it's not different in the sense of like, no other technologies matter. I think a lot of other technologies do matter. Biotech, there's a lot going on right now around genetic technology that I think is really important. Like, these other places really do matter a lot. And historically, other modes of technology, other modes of capital have been the dominant modes. In the book, I have a quote from a magazine essay in the 1830s. So, almost 200 years ago, and it was talking about the railroads cutting across the American West. And I think I'll just quote it. It's just a couple sentences here from this essay, where they're talking about the raw power of industrial machinery and technological progress. And the magazine essay, the writer goes, quote, "Objects of exalted power and grandeur elevate the mind that seriously dwells on them and impart to it greater compass and strength. Its vastness and magnificence will prove communicable and add to the standard of the intellect of our country." They're talking about the railroad there, right? Like, I take a train all the time for work. I don't know if I stand there and like marvel in the grandeur of the train and I'm like, my intellect is elevated for having witnessed this like commuter rail. But like, 200 years ago, that was the case. And I think if you filter out the kind of Baroque language of the time, and maybe put that language into ChatGPT and say, rewrite this in the style of a startup pitch deck or a McKinsey trend report, and it would sound pretty much exactly the same as if they were talking about the railroad or about the latest innovation in chatbots, right? And so it's like there's a history here to also this kind of idealism, this ideological kind of anti-materialist ideas of how we think about technology and its power.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to distinguish technology as being a part of capitalism, right? That the technological form as it exists under capitalism is unique. Like, it's wrong to confuse it, I think, with like other like pre-capitalist technology because it didn't serve the same function. But I kind of wonder, like, especially as it concerns information technology. I mean, maybe it's it's still a distinction I'm thinking about, but it's like, I think of early capitalist technology, whether it's from like mechanization or electrification or the move to mass production, everything being very focused on the concrete area of production, right? Like, we're making goods in a new and efficient way. And by doing that, we completely change society, right? Like, all social, legal, economic relationships come out of that, come from the production floor in that sense. And right, that creates new cities, that creates new ways of living. But like, I wonder if you'd agree with this. I'm like wondering if like information technology is perhaps different in the sense that it starts infiltrating and having a direct effect as opposed to like a side effect on relationships that are not economic. And in doing so, like, creates new commodities, creates new, like, it commodifies new aspects of life that was previously, which technology has always done, I admit, but in like being able to mediate a relationship between Liam and I, it creates something that like used to be free, used to be just workers on the floor, and now, I mean, we're using a platform who's probably stealing all our data right now, and we hate it very much, right? So yeah, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think this is something that is very core to the power of information technology and has been very core to its growth and its ability to grow both like financially but also socially, is this ability to kind of turn things that were not previously capitalized or assetized or rentized into modes of capital, into value production or value holding assets, into opportunities for extracting rents, right? And so this is something I talk a lot about in the book, is that like, we have to understand like the platform business model as a updating and an expansion of rentier capitalism, right? It's the same kind of model that we tend to associate with landlords, where it's about like it's about establishing these kind of checkpoints, choke points, these gates that you can then charge people a tribute or rent or a toll in order to access some other good or service that you have that they need to do something else, right? And so in the kind of classic land like landed property relationship here. It's, I'm a landlord, I own land. You need access to that land to, live in a house or have a business or drive your carriage through or whatever it might be, right? And so I can set up ways to extract rents from you just by the fact that you are like accessing that land, right? I'm not doing anything else. It's pretty passive. But because you're accessing something I own, then I can charge you rent. Platforms do the same exact thing. You don't own anything that you like, any software that you're using, any platform that you're using, any smart object that has software embedded in it. You don't own that digital aspect of it, right? There's a digital enclosure that happens. And so that's the platform doing that kind of enclosure. And then they set up ways to maintain control over it, right? Through terms of service agreements and so on, and establish ways to extract continual rent. Whether that's money through, say, a subscription, or that's data through the kind of constant stream of user data that comes off of a platform. This is rentier capitalism. Like, when I was thinking about platforms, I'm thinking like, not this is something completely new, unprecedented. We've never encountered this before, and we have to think of like radically new ways to understand it. Instead, I'm like, let's go back to the fundamentals, the critique of political economy. How would Marx write about platforms, if he were writing about them in Capital Volume 3, where he's talking about rentier relations and finance capital, right? I'm like, well, let me put on that hat and like try to write about platforms as if I were Marx in Volume 3. And similarly, I've done the same thing with talking about data, right? Data as this new form of capital. Data is not a commodity per se. It's not, and data is not labor, right? These are all ways that I think people get confused when they try to understand the digital economy. They start applying like, is it a labor theory of value? Is data like embodied labor? Or is data just like a commodity that like any other commodity? I argue that data is a form of capital, right? It's like this necessary thing that these tech companies need to keep in motion. Marx defines capital as value in motion, right? As soon as it stops circulating, as soon as it stops being dynamic, then it stops being capital. Same with data. Like data is only valuable if it's in motion, if it's like continually being generated and renewed and circulated and shared and processed in different ways. And it's a mode of capital that we have like a whole industry, the tech industry built around data. And it has become so successful at acquiring vast amounts of wealth and power through that, that everyone else has also started retooling their industry around data, right? And so like data is the dominant mode of capital in our political economic system today. But again, that we've had lots of different modes of capital. Capital is composed of lots of different kinds of capital, and different types have been dominant in different periods of capitalism's development. It's just right now we have a mode that is weird because it's not really very neatly tied to the real economy, the economy of like manufacturing and production and commodities. It's much more tied to a fictitious economy, right? An economy of like speculation and financial engineering. We've seen now like data capital starting to be tried to tie to a more kind of like quote unquote real economy system through the push in AI, which a lot of that is like, okay, let's build like real material infrastructure, data centers and these kinds of things. But even then, it's like, that's not the point. The purpose here is to build abstract AI models, right? That are also still much more tied to like financial speculation and what I call like check kiting, right? You're writing a check today, or you're cashing a check today, hoping that the money's going to be in the account at some point in the future. That's what AI is right now. And so it's a weird kind of capitalism because it is so fictitious in its operations that I think it becomes hard to understand.
When you mention data infrastructure in particular, or computational infrastructure in particular, and I think there's quite a lot of rentierism just on the infrastructure side of things. I mean, you have already, when you buy the capital in order to run your AI models, you're essentially buying from a company that operates as a rentier, right? Like NVIDIA. It's not normal that they make 100% margin on many of their cards, right? I mean, I sold an NVIDIA card the other day for significantly more than I bought it for, you know what I mean? And it's that's not normal. But then once you build these data centers, and so there is a degree of human improvement that goes into them, right? They're renting their computational infrastructure through, whether it's AWS, Google Cloud, or any of the smaller cloud providers. And I see a certain degree of rentierism there, which makes me wonder, why you might be, you think I mean, in your book, you are somewhat dismissive of the sort of techno-feudalism thesis. I don't know if you've read Yanis Varoufakis' book, but I was hoping you could kind of explain to us why you think, you do a little of it in the book, but I was wondering if you could go through it here, why you think that we shouldn't be calling these things techno-capitalism or neo-feudalism, and why it's not a new mode of production.
Yeah, absolutely. And the point around rentierism and data centers is also really important because it's not just tech companies like AWS or Google or Microsoft that are building and running these data centers and charging people rents for access to the cloud or for storing their data there, computation, whatever. Actually, most of the data centers that exist are being invested in and built by real estate investment trust. I mean, these are private equity firms and real estate companies that are the biggest players in data centers, right? It's not as well reported on or well known because we think the pipes of the internet are owned by the platforms of the internet, but that's not really the case. You've got companies like Blackstone, which has invested $50 billion into data center development. Blackstone is one of the world's largest private equity firms, and the central thing that they do is run one of the world's largest real estate investment trust, which is a kind of invite-only mutual fund for investing in real estate, but the buy-in is being able to purchase billions of dollars of shares in the trust, right? And so it's pretty much only the University of California endowment, has is a huge investor in there, right? These kinds of, companies. And Blackstone has invested $50 billion into building data centers with another $50 billion in the pipeline for data center development. Data centers are now their most profitable investment for Blackstone, right? It's also, these are the companies that actually own the pipes of the internet. These are the companies that are the scholar Dan Green, who's written a really great paper on this called "The Landlords of the Internet," really lays this out in depth. This is tied directly to why I dismiss the neo-feudalist or techno-feudalist argument, because real estate, landed property, rentier relations, landlords, none of these things are new to capitalism, nor are any of these things, outside of or contradictory to capitalism. This is very much core. If we go back to the guru of capital himself, right, Marx, we tend to think Marx only talks about capital and labor, right? Wages and profit. But that's not true. He talks a ton about a tripartite antagonistic relationship between capital, labor, and landlords, between wages, profit, and rent. And he talks about how these three kind of core actors of the capitalist system are in mutual antagonism to each other. Everybody hates each other, but everybody must live with the other because the system is built around these relations. And so when I hear people talk about a neo-feudalism or a techno-feudalism argument, what I hear them saying is, oh my God, there's rentier relations happening in my capitalism. That must mean it's not capitalism anymore, right? And it's like, no, that's not how that works. Like feudalism is much more than, is defined by much more than the extraction of rent or the ownership of land. Feudalism is defined by a like a mode of organizing life, and a mode of organizing like access to the means of reproduction, such that you rely on a lord in order to give you like, you know, a house to live in, cows to milk, you know, corn to farm, you know, wheat to make bread. Like you rely on a lord for every aspect of your life. Your means of reproduction are owned by a lord. That's not the system that we live in right now. We rely on a lot of landlords who demand that we pay rent to them for access to stuff, but our means of reproduction are not owned and controlled by a lord. And that, like, so to me, the neo-feudalism or techno-feudalism argument is not actually a substantial political economic analysis. It's more of a vibe, right? They're like, this feels like feudalism. This, like, kind of aesthetically or culturally, I get feudal vibes from this, right? And I'm fine with that. Hey, if you want to make a stylistic or vibe-based argument that like this feels like feudalist, then cool, run with that. But be explicit about it. A lot of the analysis does not say that. They kind of either explicitly say or gesture towards a political economic critique of a system, but it's just not capitalism just because there's rent involved.
A core part of Vero Fox's argument with techno-feudalism is that this new type of, like, rentierism has always existed in capitalism, but this new type of digital rentierism is taking the forefront. Like that, you know, all the top valued companies are more rentier companies, and traditional businesses that rely on making a capitalist product by manufacturing cars and so forth are sort of falling in behind them. And as you mentioned in your book, the car companies are looking to get in on that too by being more data companies than car companies. So you don't see this. Do you see this as like as a fundamental change?
I mean, I agree. I agree that like this kind of digital rentierism is now really in the forefront and it is really dominant. But that's still a type of capitalism. Like if we think about this in terms of like, think of the last, like, you know, 40 years of financialization, right? So from like this, let's say the reign of financialization was kind of from, you know, the 70s up until maybe like the 2008 financial crash was kind of like begun the denouement of finance capitalism. It still exists. It's still really powerful, but that's the moment at which finance capitalism fell off the throne and Silicon Valley tech capital started to become ascendant. But that was a mode of capitalism that was based around like financial engineering, speculation, right? Like these kinds of things that were quite explicitly not about like value generation or profit creation in strict senses, but were more about value capture, right? Through stripping and sweating assets, through, you know, complex forms of speculation and, you know, financial engineering. Would we call that not capitalism, but instead financierism? I mean, no one ever presented that argument, right? They're like, this is financial capitalism. And so to me, it strikes me as the same when people are like, now we have a mode of capitalism that's around like digital rentierism, right? Capturing and extracting rents through, you know, whether it's dollars or data, through these platforms, through these data centers, whatever it might be. And now they're saying it's feudalism, right? It's like, no, if it wasn't financierism, but rather financial capitalism, then what makes this not the same thing, right? Where it's like, it's not feudalism, but rather it's, you know, I call it technological capitalism, but we could call it, you know, platform capitalism or rentier capitalism or whatever we might call it. And so that to me is the like, there's an inconsistency here, which strikes me again of why I think it's a lot more of a vibe-based argument than a more substantial critical argument.
I think you're right. Especially, I think we all agree that no one here believes that we live currently under feudalism, and I honestly think that Yanis Varoufakis's argument on specifically the techno-feudalism thesis, it's misleading to give that kind of a title to a book, and I think he's a bit misleading in just saying like, oh, doesn't look like capitalism, therefore we might not be under capitalism. But then again, if you observe that, or if you believe that there are the material conditions for moving away from what like Marx's abstraction of value in commodities relies on real estate and rentierism being sort of an anomaly, right? Like it can work within capitalism, but the moment value in abstract no longer resembles human labor in commodities or like in what we call markets, right? Then is it capitalism anymore? And I think the answer is probably no. So like I feel like the question or the usefulness of the techno-feudalism kind of argument is like maybe we are observing that there are the material conditions to move in that direction, and in that case we might be headed towards a world in which it's maybe a different form of capitalism or a different mode of production that doesn't look like the one we currently have. And I think in your book, you talk about you kind of give this idea of like the platforms being like a shopping mall in a sense, right? And like obviously there's a certain aspect to it there, but like Liam and I were talking last night and we were saying, well, one of the things about that like analogy is like, well, there's multiple, I know all the shopping malls are owned by these very like rentier, like 3 rentierist firms that essentially just like set up all around the country. But like, the thing in the mall is that like it's a model that you can like predict. Like you as a store can, yes, you have an unfair contract, but it doesn't change from one day to the next. You sign a contract, it's under law. It's like there's a certain level of it's kind of like what Adam Smith says in Wealth and Nations, where it's like, okay, like there's kind of 2 types of real estate. There's the real estate where it's where there's no human improvement done and no human improvement possible, and you can't even make crops on it, but nonetheless it still has this weird value, and the landlord can still nonetheless charge a rent for it, and that's like the worst form. And then there's the kind where it's like in between that's like really compatible with capitalism, where you're charging rents and you have a monopoly price on it, but we haven't like gone so far that there's like not an aspect of human improvement in real estate. And so, yeah, I mean, I just wonder, like, especially as we look at what's happening with platforms, with the way cloud is going, with the control that all these companies have on AI, whether or not, like, we shouldn't be wondering whether or not there is, a fundamental change in aspects of our mode of production, at least.
Yeah, look, there very well might be. And the shopping mall analogy here, if we think about like the kind of human improvement, I talk about this in the book a little bit when I make this analogy to shopping malls, that it's like, usually a shopping mall owner does do some kind of like improvements, right? Because they want to get people into the mall. And so you can think about like with a platform, right? Where it's like, okay, we're going to make this like fun to use, and we're going to make it where people want to come here and do their shopping because there's like cool water features and like there's places to hang out and there's things that make it an attractive place, right? And so usually a shopping mall owner is not just like a passive landlord in that sense of like, great, people come here and I get to extract rents from all of the people that set up, that have shop fronts here. I get to, and then I talk about, if we take it out to the platform model, right? I also get to extract rent from like every form of social interaction that happens, from even just people browsing and walking around, right? And that's through like the data that's created through people just hanging out in the mall or in the platform, right? But, I'm going to make this like a place where people want to come. And so there still is that kind of aspect of human improvement. I do think that like, you're right. We're moving away from that and moving away from it in like really weird ways. On one hand, where it's like the whole idea of like having a standard lease, right? Like a 12-month lease where you're talking about, you have some certainty and standardization about like, okay, at least I know what my rent is going to be for the next 12 months. And I know that there's a contract here where it's like, if something breaks, then it's the landlord's responsibility to come and fix it or whatever. And, in practice, that might look like, having to harangue the landlord for weeks and weeks and weeks to get something fixed, right? But like, hey, at least there's a contract here. We are moving away from that, but that existence of that contract, that and the kind of like a time of certainty and standardization over a specific like temporal span of months or years or however, that was more of just like a limitation of ability, It was like really hard. There was a lot of transaction cost involved in like having a dynamic contract that it's like, it's constantly changing from week to week or whatever. But those transaction costs, because of like information technology, are limiting, right? And so like, and elsewhere in the book, I talk about the kind of like dynamism of personalization and how that's applied to things like pricing or underwriting in an insurance context, right? So this kind of like dynamic real-time ability to rewrite the contract of what like your car insurance might look like. There's models of insurance now. They're by no means like dominant, but they are growing, and there's a lot of interest in the industry around this dynamic contracting, which is the idea that every time you enter your car, that's a new contract for insurance. And so that means the policies and the price and the conditions of your insurance contract can change every time you enter your car because you're entering into a new relationship. And this gets around regulatory requirements around like how often you can change a contract for insurance, right? You can only do it once every 12 months because of regulation. That's meant to tamper down on insurers kind of, just wildly changing your price from week to week or day to day or month to month. But if you have a form of insurance that is a new contract every time you get in your car, then that is a loophole for those regulations. And that's possible now because of information technology.
I was going to say, we see this, like, especially with the insurance stuff. I mean, even France has a very regulated insurance market, like all across the board. It's really hard to, just all the stuff I heard you guys talking about, what goes on in California, I was like, oh my God. It's getting home insurance here. Like, the state has accepted that there's this notion of uninsurability. Well, for whatever realness there is to it or not, we're indifferent, right? But the way it works is like all insurance providers will like provide housing insurance, for example, and then everywhere across France. And the criteria which they can actually like set prices on is like really, it's fixed by a board, and it's basically just like how many square meters and a little bit of actual risk in the area. But if there's ever an event that is the insurance companies feel is uninsurable, they go to the government and say, hey, this is uninsurable. And then the government decides whether or not it is. And then if it is, then the government just pays for everything across all insurers, right? So it's a different system, but obviously it's going the same way. And like one way I've seen this is my wife, when she got a car, a lot of companies were like, oh, we don't want to take you on because, you don't have a driving record yet. You got your license recently. So we ended up having to use one of those companies that tracks you while you drive and judges how you drive or whatever. And of course, they can't raise your rates because you drive bad or whatever. So what they do is instead they say, oh, you're going to pay X amount a year, but if you drive well, we'll take up to 40% off or whatever. And that's like one of these clever ways of getting around it. And, as you say, I haven't heard of this changing every time, like changing the contract every time you drive. But I'm sure what they'll do is they'll say, hey, this is a 1-year contract. And then they're just going to say, but within that year period, we have these adjustments that were technically foreseen in the contract. But if you can't like realistically understand how those decisions are made, it's like obviously a way of subverting like positive law on the subject.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. If you can't raise prices, then why not lower prices by setting the initial price so high that by lowering it, you're effectively raising it, right? Or you're meeting in the middle, in other words, through that way. Just since you brought up the French context in insurance, I just want to shout out as well that, like, there's a really fantastic book by the historian and philosopher Francois Ewald called The Birth of Solidarity, which is a history of the French welfare state. And it is like a lot of these notions of like social solidarity that are baked into the original purpose of something like insurance are born out of kind of French institutions and French ideals. Now, this is also, I think this ties into what we were talking about around technological capitalism, where it's like the question then is always, how has capital over the last 300 years perverted these things in new and interesting ways? And so to go back to the idea of the shopping mall, now it's the case that the owner of the shopping mall doesn't need to invest in using the shopping mall being a pleasurable experience, right? Now the owner of the shopping malls, X, formerly known as Twitter or Facebook, now known as Meta or whatever, right? They can actively make these places abusive to users. What Cory Doctorow calls enshittification, right? They can actively make these places, not just derelict, as if now it's the abandoned shopping mall from Dawn of the Dead or whatever, right? But it's not abandoned. We all still have to shop there. It's just now there's like zombies and hostile architecture and like, the facade is falling down and there's holes in the floor and stuff, but we still have to shop there, And so like, again, that is still capitalism. It is the logics of technological capitalism, or rather it's the logics of capital that technologies have now allowed to actualize in new ways. Wrapping it, like going back to the insurance example, kind of going all over, but we're connecting it together here, folks. In my reading and my study on the insurance industry, I've read histories of the life insurance industry, and you have these as statements from actuaries from 120 years ago, from insurance executives from 100 years ago, talking about the ideals of personalized risk assessment, right? Having a risk pool of one, right? Talking about how can we take advantage of the cutting edge innovations in information technology to better score and price risk in more precise and granular ways that are also more profitable, and figuring out who we need to exclude based on our actuarial calculations. But the innovations in information technology they were talking about were index cards and filing cabinets, right? And so you have these ideals, these aspirations that capital across various industries and modes have expressed for a very long time. The idea of having a highly dynamic, personalized, and exclusionary insurance contract is not something new to, innovations in vehicular telematics or fitness wearables or whatever. It is instead something that is being a long-standing goal, a dream that is now being unlocked by these technological capabilities. And it is completely congruent with the ideals of Silicon Valley, of technological capital around optimization, personalization, these kinds of things. And so again, like this, I think this is a through line of my book, is that like I'm trying to understand the current moment and where it's going. And in large part, I'm trying to do that by understanding its history, where it came from, and also understanding it in through the fundamentals of, we don't need like radically new theories or frameworks to understand this. What we need to do is go back to the fundamentals and update our critique of political economy to see how these things, have a through line. They have a history. They have a development. This is historical materialism, right? Like that, all of these things that these various conditions we find ourselves in don't come out of nowhere, but they come out of somewhere. And so it's about tracing that development and seeing the kind of the underlying logics and structures that are kind of, while they change in their form, there's a remarkable dynamism to capital, but there is also a remarkable stability to the logics and goals and relations of capitalism.
This archetype of the mechanic and the Luddite, I mean, I found that really interesting. Liam and I kind of embody that, not the both, but like I've always kind of been the more mechanic, and Liam's always been the more.
Oh yes, I'm a huge Luddite, and not just in the reclaimed sense you were trying to use it, but more in that I have I have a inherent revulsion to all things tech more and more. I mean, which I think a lot of people do, and I think a lot of people, especially on the left, do. So I wanted to ask you. You say that it's important for us as critics or analyzing capitalism to sort of incorporate both the mechanic, the understanding of how these systems work, and also the Luddite of being willing to say that this sort of progress is not inevitable, and we can say to some things, no, this should stop. And I really like that. My question is, do I have to be the mechanic too? Because I don't want to know. I don't want to understand the. Patrick again is very fascinated by AI and computer systems and all this stuff. I don't like it, but should I? Do I have to? Do us leftist critics of capitalism have to? And relatedly, do you think that there's a lack of understanding of tech?
Yeah, and to be clear, Liam has a migraine right now because he's sleeping next to my server rack.
We need to get you in a Faraday cage, my man. Get you away from all these harmful 5G waves that are beaming into your brain. The answer to both of your questions, unfortunately, Liam, is yes. I think that we have to be I think we have to embody the mechanic in the way that I talk about it in the book of this sense of like, knowing how the machine is put together, how its parts functions, what work it does, right? Importantly, though, that's not this is not a backdoor way of me being like, we all need to learn how to code, right? Like, that's not the case at all. I don't think that's helpful in the same way. What I mean, though, is having like material knowledge of these systems. What do they actually do? How do they actually work, right? I talk about it as like, you got to throw a system into the, interrogation room, shine the big white light in its face and be like, who do you work for? What do you do? And this goes back to the earlier conversation we were having around idealism, where, a lot of our understanding of technology and a lot of the critical understanding of technology on the left or in the public, like, comes from idealist sources, right? It's about like, we read the marketing language, or we hear about the hype, or we hear some kind of breathless journalism or statements from executives, right? And we kind of base our understanding on the technology on statements that are in large part disconnected from the actual technology itself, how it actually works, what it actually does. And you can create a lot of really interesting and only, not even wrong kind of critical analysis of technology if your understanding is based on like the marketing and the hype and the reporting and, all these things that are kind of like disconnected in various ways from the system itself. Like, you can still create a lot of critical analysis and attention around it, but you also risk yourself, and I think we see this a lot with leftists, of kind of creating a critique that is based on a straw person version of the technology. It's not based on how the thing actually works or what it actually does. It's also, what the historian of technology Lee Vinsel calls criti-hype. You end up kind of fetishizing the worst. You fetishize the hype around the technology by spending all of our critical attention talking about the hype and thus giving the hype more substance than it actually has, because you're channeling your like mental energy into it, right? And I think that ends up as well becoming this mode of critique that I've also talked about as like, putting a flashlight under your chin in a dark room and in a scary voice, just repeating what the marketing copy says, for a system where it's like, the company said this thing and they said it in an enthusiastic way. I'm going to say the same thing, but I'm going to say it in a scary way or an anxious way. But everybody's just saying the same thing, right?
Right. You're either for God or against God.
Yeah, exactly. But we all believe that God exists in the same way and that he does the same things in our lives, right? And so I think that we're really reaching the limits of that mode of like idealistic critique or ideology critique of technology, of tech capital. And I think we need instead to ground it in a more material understanding. And this to me is the mechanic, right? Like, it's not about going and learning how to code, but it is about going and actually asking, does this thing work the way that you say it does, right? Like, how is it actually built? You say this is AI, but when I tear the Scooby-Doo mask off of it, I just see a lot of human workers, and so I call this in the book Potemkin AI, right? This idea that like a lot of things are said to be AI, but they're a Potemkin village of AI. When you look behind the facade, it's a lot of human labor dispersed across the world, largely the global south, who are making these things work in various ways. At times, even like doing the Wizard of Oz trick of standing in for the robot or standing in for the AI, pretending to be technology, because the technology doesn't actually work in the way that people say that it does, right? And so I think we really need this kind of material understanding, because this is the strongest way that we can fight back against these systems, against capital. This is the strongest way that the strongest grounding is not by refuting their hype, but by refuting the system itself. And so that does require, pushing past the marketing a little bit further, asking some more critical technical questions, also just knowing that like not everybody can do everything, right? Like talking to other people who understand these things in more materialist or technical ways and learning from them. And this is what, that's that idea of the mechanic. And part of that as well, I think, is about indulging in a mechanical curiosity, a curiosity about how things work in the world, which has largely been stripped from us, right? Like we've been de-skilled in our ability to even have curiosity about the mechanical functioning of the world. Everything is just black boxes stacked on top of black boxes, right? And I think that's in large part by design. It's a way of de-skilling a public so that you don't have to worry about them knowing how a thing works, questioning it, maybe modifying it or repairing it for themselves, right? Like, and so part of the mechanic here is also about fighting back against a widespread, ongoing de-skilling of the population, in the sense of not just taking skills away from them, but taking opportunities to gain skills away from people.
So yeah, it's funny you mentioned kind of the Mechanical Turk that we see in AI, because I went to one of those Amazon stores a while back, and we were like, all right, whatever. It's been going on for years. Let's try it. And I thought it was really funny how it took them over an hour to process like my purchases, like for me to get a receipt. And we were all joking, that's probably because someone was actually doing it, watching the video manually. And then it turns out, news story, it was all just that. So I absolutely agree with you on the black box aspect of things. I mean, it's remarkable. But on the AI question, I wonder, I remember on your podcast you were talking about how you had to submit the copy for this, a year in advance, right, before it was published?
Yeah.
Man, that makes things rough, huh?
It does, yeah. Yeah, I wrote it in I actually wrote it in like 2022, 2023 is when I was writing it, and then like the final editing kind of happened like late 23. So book publishing has this like long lag, and it is rough when you're trying to write about things that are currently and dynamically happening.
Yeah, and I'm wondering like if your like opinion has kind of evolved, because for me like AI technology has kind of been the same since the 70s in many ways, right? Like especially from a defense standpoint, it's what, ARPA, which became DARPA, has been obsessed with the idea of some form of artificial intelligence, notably for defense purposes. And I think like that's one of the things we don't talk about a lot, which is like, a lot of the things that we joke about as being kind of useless in AI are actually really great for mass surveillance systems. Like I'm sure you're aware of like the early 2000s project, Total Information Awareness, where the US was just going to spy on everyone, and they wanted it to be like a cool Star Trek bridge kind of vibe, and they wanted to have centers all over the US. They didn't do it, and then we found out they actually kind of did under PRISM. And like I like when people are always like, oh, the only thing I can see useful in artificial intelligence is like writing scam emails, which is obviously a real use. I'm also like, yeah, but also summarizing every call you've ever made. Like only mass computational systems can get away with that. And so anyway, to wrap all that up, I say, so what's changed in AI in the last few years? The only thing I think has really changed is everyone has become, or capital has become convinced it's worth dumping money to, which I wonder, right? Because there's so much idealism in AI. No one doubts that. But there's something very material in wasting all this money on it, in forcing it into business processes. I obviously think it's BS that like Elon Musk. I mean, he probably wants to do the same thing, but that Mark Zuckerberg thinks he can replace his engineers with AI or whatever.
To add to that question, though, before you answer it, I kind of, from my perspective, I do think there has been a meaningful change in the past 2 years. After years of hype, the generative AI things that have happened in the last 2 years, which I completely agree is overhyped, but it does feel like a meaningful change and a technology that for most people seems like something that can finally do something, for better or for worse.
Yeah. What is like, has your opinion of AI changed since you wrote the book? And are we right to kind of like just be dismissive of it as like hype in the same way crypto was, knowing that crypto, for all the hype and BS it is, does have an insane amount of real money that's been put into it and is increasingly useful, especially for like I think about Russia, which is under sanction, right? Like they are becoming reliant on this stuff. So my point are there material elements that are often being missed, I think, in the AI discourse that go very much against the idealism of the technologists who promote it?
Yeah. So it's a really great question. I think in a broad sense, I don't think my thinking about AI has really changed, right? Like what has changed maybe is like the concrete details or case studies or how this has developed. But like I did, knowing that books are meant to be things that exist long past their publication date as well. Like I really did try to only use examples that I thought would stand the test of time, that I could look back in 5 years and be like, okay, that was a great example because it identified or exemplified like a core dynamic or thing that I wanted to talk about in a more fundamental sense. So while it is tough to like try to write about things that are currently happening in big ways, right? Like huge money deals and a $500 billion Stargate project being announced. And, all of this is, again, though, like idealism. None of that money actually exists, in any way, not currently, right? And so, like, it was also, I think, a real effort in not getting caught up in the headlines while writing the book, which I think is something that is really important for all of us to do, is to not get caught up in the headlines. Because like headlines change, rapidly. Headlines change after publication all the time. And so like if we kind of create our understanding of the technology based on headlines about it, then we will always feel unmoored. We'll never feel anchored in any kind of like real systematic or fundamental analysis of the thing, the core relations and dynamics here, right? So I will say that about the book and its kind of time horizon. Now, in terms of like what is different about AI right now, especially in the kind of post-November 2022 era, right? Which is when ChatGPT was released. And that is what really sparked, you had at that same time the implosion of FTX. So again, this is the collapse moment of Web3 and the crypto economy. And then very shortly after, you have the release of ChatGPT, and that's the birth of the AI, and specifically generative AI boom, right? Because everyone put all that billions of dollars that was going into Web3, crypto, blockchain stuff, immediately pivoted towards going into AI. But then lots more billions of dollars went into it because lots more people were like, oh, AI is actually useful for us. At least I can imagine it to be. The core difference I've talked about before in other places around like what's different between the Web3 boom and the generative AI boom, right? And a lot of it comes down to like, can you imagine a use case, right? Can you imagine multiple use cases? Can you, if the you is a person from various different industries or walks of lives or places, can you imagine use cases, right? Blockchain had a real use case problem. No one could imagine a use case for blockchain. It was really, really hard. I talked to people in the insurance industry whose job it was to imagine use cases of blockchain for the insurance industry, because insurers are like, we need a blockchain innovator in residence, because if you do things with blockchain, then money just magically appears. Those people had a hard time thinking of real use cases for blockchain in the insurance industry, right? And so, blockchain had this use case problem, and it was also funny. It was stupid, right? The use cases that people were touting it were like Bored Apes and NFT and obvious like scams and gambling and things like that, right? The only use case that it has is like to be a 21st century version of like a gold bug, right? Where it's like, don't buy gold, buy Bitcoin. Or if you want to do like black market financial stuff, like with Russia, right? Then like, cool, you don't need to do that with like precious metals and gemstones or whatever. You can do that with Bitcoin. Cool. Not a very useful use case for like 99% of people, right? And so this contributed to like, blockchain was a pure supply side boom. It was a lot of people a lot of investors funneling money into it, and telling and trying to create markets and create consumer demand for it. It just never really took off in a major way because nobody could imagine a use case for it or even understand what it was in any real way. So this is also why, despite like billions and billions and billions of dollars being funneled into Web3, it just evaporated overnight, basically, right? Like, I mean, sure, Bitcoin is like still going up and stuff, but a lot of that is largely because you have like people in power, like, Trump or Javier Milei in Argentina, like pumping and dumping it, right? But it still does not have a use case beyond being a purely speculative asset for gambling. And so that's why it evaporated overnight. It had like, it left no trace after, even despite having billions of dollars behind it. The difference with AI is you can imagine a lot of use cases, right? Because AI has the kind of the human element, right? It's not human like in any way at all, but you can imagine it being human like. And so you can imagine it doing things that humans would do, which is effectively an infinite number of use cases across every aspect of humanity. And so it becomes this thing, a parlor trick, which is what these chatbots are, right? Claude, ChatGPT, like really impressive parlor tricks for the most part. And then some people get really wrapped up into using them in their workflow, using like Copilot for coding or for writing marketing copy. We know from a number of studies that it doesn't make you better at those things. In fact, it de-skills you and makes you like largely worse or the same at doing those things. But people are caught up in the workflow, and some people are caught up in it in large part because they're like investing now in a future that they hope to be. But I think the get back to it, what makes generative AI have so much more money from so many different places and so many different places telling you this is the future, whether you like it or not, you have to use it, in education and government and business, whatever, right? It's because you can imagine use cases for it. And I think that gives it more sticking power. But it is, make no mistake, AI is still a purely supply side boom. It's a lot of people investing in creating the technology, creating the infrastructure, creating the hype, with no real business model, no real plan for how to use it in effective or useful ways, no real consumer demand. In fact, most people despise it. They don't want anything to do with it. They think that it's shit, and
That's how I feel.
and I think most people agree with you, Liam, which is also really weird. Usually with a new technology, people give Silicon Valley the benefit of the doubt. If they don't understand it, they just say, well, it sounds great. I just don't understand it. I guess I'm a Luddite, but hey, like, I'm glad they're doing it. AI is weird as well, where it's also one of the first technologies that Silicon Valley has put its full might behind. And in response, everybody has said, this sucks. We don't want this or want anything to do with it. But they have invested so much into it, materially and ideologically, that they have to keep pushing it. And they've successfully enrolled lots of other industries and institutions and governments into investing in it ideologically and materially as well. And so it becomes this thing of, you got to use it whether you like it or not, because we got to make it happen, because we have put so much of our worth and so much of our future into this thing. And so I think that's what makes AI different, is it does not have the use case problem, and it has allowed it to grow in this way. Now, I think it's still a bubble. I think it's going to collapse. I think as well that all of the attention is large, and an investment is largely put into generative AI, which is only one form of AI, a pretty recent form. And in reality, there's other forms of AI that have existed for way longer, and are way more materially important in people's lives. And these are things like predictive AI or optimization AI, right? Things that make decisions about systems, about institutions, about people's lives, right? It's about, it's the way that the police use AI facial recognition to determine who they're going to harass or arrest. It's the way that, welfare agencies use machine learning models to determine who's at risk of fraud or is a welfare cheat, and thus who is going to be have their benefits canceled or is going to be subject to investigation, right? The list of those things go on for is so long, and they have existed for a very long time. And it goes to that idealism versus materialism. If we talk about the real material impacts of AI, it's not yet like generative AI. It is and has for a long time been these other forms of predictive and optimization AIs.
Right. And, it also, I think you've mentioned this before, but it also doesn't matter whether or not it's AI in some cases, right? Especially with the, the welfare case in the Netherlands. France had a recent thing where it turns out we were using this to determine whether or not we should, for the same purpose, for fraud detection or whatever. And it was found to be, defective if you believe the goal is to actually clamp down on fraud, or, when the Israelis used it to justify their targeting. There's definitely that aspect of it. If you believe the bullshit job thesis, right? That there's just a lot of people who are doing a lot of jobs where they don't really feel that their contribution matters. can AI just replace that? And no, I don't think it'll ever be efficient. Everyone knows, anyone who's ever worked in IT will say, oh yeah, we spent 3 days writing that bash script. We probably should have just done it manually. It would have been so much more efficient. But we automated it anyway, and we wasted the time on it. And I feel like there's a lot of that in generative AI, which is like, oh yeah, let's replace it with this. It's obviously going to be more costly, like more labor intensive, ironically, but they're still going to kind of do it.
Yeah. So we wanted to conclude this by putting a bit of a European perspective on it, because this conversation, I mean, like almost all conversations about tech, has been very America-centric, even though none of us are in America, right?
Even though I live in Australia.
Yeah, but that's kind of interesting, and and we're both in Europe, and that's kind of an interesting thing about tech is that it's cloud-based, it's delocalized, it's global, but at the same time, the industry is so overwhelmingly concentrated in Silicon Valley and in a couple cities in China, and a little bit in Seattle or whatever, or Austin, but it's so concentrated in these areas. And here in Europe, there is a constant sort of hand-wringing and anxiety about how Europe has missed the boat on this, and that none of the large tech companies, none of the platforms European, with like a couple exceptions like Spotify. And President Macron is constantly, he's been talking since 2017 about making France the new Silicon Valley, and now the European Parliament the European Commission has released this big report on how to make AI European and all this stuff. And so my question for you is, like, why do you think that is, that Europe and most of the world has been so left by the wayside with this? And relatedly, should we as leftists in Europe care about that? Is this actually a loss for Europe?
Yeah, and look, I mean, in the French context, right? Like Bernard Arnault, right, the CEO of LVMH, one of the richest men in the world, invested a huge amount of money into Mistral AI because he was like, he's a huge French nationalist, and he's like, I want to invest in a French AI, and last I heard, the Mistral was not really doing well or doing anything, and so you're right. Like there is a lot of the we live in despite the second Trump imperium now like trying to wind down American hegemony as like a going affair, right? Where it's like, well, we don't really care about that anymore. It's still the fact that we live in a bipolar world where it's the U.S. and it's China, and that is also defined in the sense that like right now the U.S. and China are in a proxy war against each other. It's an economic proxy war, and the front line is the tech sector. And like, can China get NVIDIA chips, or like GPUs, and like so like we live in a bipolar world, and the tech sector is a massive component of that because the tech sector is the dominant mode of capital today, right? And so like that also just means that a lot of the oxygen is in the room when it comes to like technology or AI or whatever is either being sucked into the American lungs or Chinese lungs, and like everyone else is gasping to get a breath of it. And I think Europe has like kind of situated itself as this reluctant middle ground. I mean, geographically a middle ground between the US and China, but also like in every other regard, this reluctant middle ground where it's like, I think Europe wants to have it both ways, where they can be both partners with Europe and partners with America and partners with China, while also asserting its own independence and its own pathway where we're partners, but we're not dependent on these two places. But also we swing widely between, are we anti-American or are we anti-Chinese? Are we going to strip the Huawei out of our walls, or are we going to stop buying Teslas? And so like there's I think that like it's an interesting question. Why has Europe not had such a strong tech sector? I think part of that comes down to the political economy, but also the political economy and law, the relationship between those, right? Like Europe also sets itself up as a third way regulatory in terms of regulation. It's, you've got GDPR, you got the EU AI Act, right? These are rights-based and risk-based frameworks for regulating AI. The EU really actually puts itself forward as a leader in the world in terms of like trying to think seriously and critically and innovatively around like, how do we regulate these things, right? And a lot of that comes down to like Europe is the birthplace of the welfare state, right? And so there's a strong regulatory culture there, which I think is good, you know? Like I don't think it's done in the best ways. I think it's not done in very good ways, a lot of times. But I think the impulse is generally good of like, we're the welfare state, we're the regulatory state. We want to make the market work for people and have oversight over its operations. That's not attractive to anybody working in tech. That's not attractive to people working in most industries. But it's been okay in terms of like the automotive industry for Germany, for example, or these other industries. You know, I mean, the oil and gas industry for the Scandinavian countries, right? Like, because these are state industries. These are industries that the state has thrown its weight behind and said, we're going to support these industries, right? And there's going to be this deep relationship between the state and this industry. And we're going to regulate it, but we're also going to support it. I don't think any country in Europe has done that with the tech sector, right? But the tech sector also has this, you know, what was identified in the early 90s as a California ideology. At its base, it's deeply libertarian, right? That doesn't mean it's anti-state. I mean, the Silicon Valley is born out of the American military state. It always has had this relationship with the state. It's always depended on the state. But it really, the tech sector also sees itself as, you know, as free enterprise, free market disruptors. And so the US, that's the land for that, right? That's the Wild West for that kind of free enterprise, free market. You know, the state will give you subsidies in the forms of like lucrative contracts, but it won't demand anything from you. And so that has benefited Silicon Valley. Now, China, opposite approach, strong state-based support and command of the industry. Even though these are private companies, they're not private in the sense that like they're like America has private companies. They're private in a like, you know, a capital hyphen state form of private. And so that's been really successful for China because they've thrown their weight behind creating this industry, these companies, these capabilities, right? Europe hasn't done that. Europe is instead saying, we're going to think about seriously, how do you regulate these places? And so that doesn't make it an attractive marketplace or an attractive place to build companies. And the state is not providing the support to build those companies in the way that the US or China is doing. And so I think, in short, that's my analysis of why Europe has kind of been left behind in terms of like not being a locus of tech hegemony in the world, is because while everyone else while China and the US were focused on like, you know, pedal to the metal, how do we like inject as much, you know, nitrous oxide into this engine as possible in the ways that align with our own ideological commitments to political economy. Europe has been, how do we put some like speed limiters on this and make sure that like the seat belts work, and that there's like, you know, inspections to see that everything's in like good operational order. And again, I think that's good. And I think it has actually been a really necessary force on the market if we think about like American tech, because they have had to take seriously some of the requirements around like European law and regulation, because Europe still is a very large market for these companies. So it has kind of served as a bit of a tempering force for American companies predominantly. But it has not served Europe in terms of creating like a strong industrial base for tech.
Yeah, and you hear a constant, you know, chorus from European VCs and, you know, and the Americans that, Europe has to transform itself into the US. No regulation, no welfare state in order to build this new economy. And I think that's pretty unappealing to people currently, but I fear that it could become more appealing as Europe sort of sinks into economic decline and people can, increasingly look at the US as, yeah, it's crazy over there, but they're making so much money.
Yeah.
And it's obviously false. Like, it's not like China built itself off this model, right? They didn't follow in the U.S. footsteps. No one can do what the U.S. does, so why would you try?
Right. It's a very self-serving, obviously, narrative for these people.
There's a lot of countries in Europe. Maybe you turn one of them into like an anarcho-capitalist like laboratory. Kind of elect your own version of Javier Milei, and see how that goes. Maybe you can get like Peter Thiel to run a charter country in Europe.
It's only a matter of time.
I mean, what's happening in Austria, right? Like, maybe hand it over to, and hey, that aligns with their politics anyways, right? So.
Well, listen, it's been really great. And I just want to thank Jathan for coming on the show and talking with us. We had a great time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jathan.
Thanks for having me on. A great conversation.
We'd like to thank Jathan for joining us for this episode of The Royal Palace. We encourage our listeners to check out his book. Again, that's The Mechanic and the Luddite, a Ruthless Criticism of Technology and Capitalism, as well as his podcast, This Machine Kills, a show we are regular listeners of ourselves. Thanks, everybody. Until next time.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. La France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.